Holy One, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, our rock and our redeemer. Alleluia. Amen. Yes, I did that for you, Julian. So what we just heard, up to the brackets, is the end of the Gospel of Mark. Does it? There's no breakfast of fish on the beach. There is no stranger on the road to Emmaus. There is no great commission, just this: he has gone ahead of you, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Now, there were brackets, right? That's because people have for years tried to put a fuller ending on this gospel, because it can't end there, right? Like, that's not okay. So they've added theological discourse. They've added post-resurrection appearances. There are actually like 2 sets of brackets that appear in some study Bibles. And as you note, these are actually printed in our Bibles in a lot of instances, usually in brackets to acknowledge that these are probably not original text sources, right? So we see all of this stuff that actually happened afterward. Yes, this came right out of the NRC. My own copy of it has 2 sets of these. But that is not original. The earliest manuscripts of Mark, the earliest documentation we have, ends just as it does before the brackets. He has gone ahead of you, and they were afraid. And you know what? I agree with you, Julian. I love Mark for this so hard. And more than that, I love this for us. In a sermon on another text in Mark, the theologian David Bartlett considers some of the crisis texts of this gospel, and this certainly counts as one of those. Crisis texts are the ones where the disciples run around like chickens with their heads cut off, kind of freaking out about the world, right? They do that a lot, but he wanted to preach on crisis texts. So initially, he considered the story earlier in the gospel of the disciples crossing the Sea of Galilee in a storm, terrified for their lives, huge crashing waves. And just when they think they're all going to sink, they're all going to drown, there comes Jesus kind of nonchalantly strolling across the waves like it's nothing at all. Jesus stills the storm, calms the waves, and reassures the disciples. And it's a great story, right? It's a great story. Hey guys, yeah, exactly. Hey guys, sup? Now, Bartlett wanted to write a sermon about how, when we are terrified, if we look for Jesus, call out to Jesus, If we cry out, "Save us, Lord," he appears, he comes to us, he saves us from all of the storms of life. Except that he hit that snag that preachers sometimes hit when we have a really great sermon in mind, which is that he went back into the text to verify the quote on which he'd based his whole premise there, and he realized that the disciples didn't cry out to be saved. That is not what they said in that moment. They are rocking along, getting super seasick. Along comes Jesus, and they don't cry, "Save us, Lord." They essentially scream, "Ah, a ghost! Oh my God! Ah!" And they freaked out even harder. What would you have done, really? I ask. And indeed, Professor Bartlett discovered that pretty much at no point in any of these crisis texts did the disciples' terror have them begging for salvation. It turns out that the disciples are more human, after all, than they are paragons of good theology or practice. I could have told him that, but Bartlett's got to do himself. So, out there on the sea, they get even more scared when it looks like a ghost gets added to the storm, like you do. In another boat, in another storm, their fear becomes sarcasm because Jesus is in the back taking a nap, and they go over and stand with their hands on their hips and they go, "Don't you care that we are perishing?" In case you ever wondered if the disciples sound like teenagers. Or, on a mountaintop with prophetic visions and blinding garments. Their terror just takes the form of confused, babbling anxiety about tents or tabernacles or dwellings, depending on your translation. But in no translation does it say that they said, "Help us." That just never actually bloop comes out of their mouths. Lots of fear, not a lot of salvation. And here, in the very last verse of Mark's gospel, there he literally says they were afraid. And then there is just silence. Silence because the fear was so powerful. Silence in the face of the divine messenger and the miraculous news of resurrection. There was just fear. Has anything ever been more relatable? I think it can be hard for us to really feel with the disciples when we read these texts and these stories. The trauma of the days that we have celebrated ritually, Palm Sunday, Maundy, Thursday, Good Friday, however we have done that. The shock of Judas rising from the table, already called out as a betrayer, disappearing into the night only to return with the confusing threat of armed soldiers and the intimacy of a kiss. The visceral terror of high ideals from all of the disciples giving way to a reality that marches with all the force of law. The grief of Peter, and likely the other disciples, realizing that what they had believed about themselves was far less true than they knew, and watching them have to re-examine quite suddenly their sense of identity as friends and as disciples. To us, these are stories, often very familiar ones. They're the basis of our faith and of our festivals, their edges smoothed out by generations of distance and familiarity and interpretation, their trauma erased by a joyful ending, while lilies and trumpets and alleluias resounding, a joyful ending that we often jump to because the middle parts are hard and icky, and that we know is going to happen, even when it's hard and icky. These stories can be hard for us to hold in all of their visceral, raw difficulty. But I wonder sometimes if they are so far removed from our own stories. We ourselves might not have sat at table with Judas Iscariot necessarily, but many of us will have eaten at table with those who would betray us when our true selves are made known, or when push comes to shove and the crucifix stands ready. We might not have listened to Peter's vehement insistence that he would absolutely stay with us no matter what and forever. Even if I have to die with you, I will not deny you, Jesus, he said. But haven't we all heard self-professed allies who are nowhere to be found when the stakes are raised? The ancient stories are our own, and this is so crucially true when our truths put targets on our backs. When the world would crucify rather than change, and it is the marginalized, the women, not the powerful, who stand and bear witness to state-sponsored violence. The ancient stories are our own, and that goes beyond the crucifixion. Though in this moment visibility can feel like standing before Pilate, standing before the crowds whipped up into mob violence by those who want to maintain power. The tomb will be empty. Resurrection comes, in the love of self and in the love of community that cannot be hurt by the powers of this world. The ancient stories are our stories, even when we are afraid. Perhaps, especially, when we are afraid. Mark's gospel begins with the words, "The beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God." Those are the very first words of the gospel. And from those very first words, the gospel writer acknowledges that it was never his intent to contain the entirety of the gospel within any one book. From the very beginning, Mark acknowledges that the story of Jesus of Nazareth is a story that will start us on a path into a good news that is not over in the moment of resurrection, but which dwells in a truth that is as much ours as it ever was Peter's or Mary's. The truth of crucifixion, still present in our world in so many ways, of the ways that prophetic voices are silenced, and violence, even legislative violence, even state-sponsored violence, still ensures compliance with the status quo. The truth of our human fear that so often makes us feel alone, unworthy, unlovable, that paralyzes us in the anxiety of the unknown and tells us that our true selves are not real and gaslights us into believing that silence is our only option. But also, we live in the truth of a grace that acknowledges our humanity, our fear, and that stays with us even when the world turns its back. The truth of a grace that goes ahead of us, makes a way for us, trusting that we will follow even when the way forward seems strange and new. We live in the truth of a love that doesn't wait for us to ask for help. A love that comes to us in our fear, that trusts us and calls to us, that does not blame us for our anxiety and trauma, but asks us to step forward in faith into the assurance of new life, even when we cannot yet see it. The disciples are afraid. And all of those crisis texts that have come before tell us that when the disciples are afraid, Jesus cannot be far away in the story, ready to reassure, ready to calm the storms, ready to call them to peace and to faith and to visibility, and a good news that speaks even in the midst of anxiety. I can almost hear the author of this gospel, who suddenly in my imagination sounds a little bit like Kermit the Frog, and you will excuse me for that, singing, "Life's like a movie, write your own ending." It's a really, really Gen X reference. I hope that y'all got that one. In chapter 1, Jesus calls disciples to follow him. And in this ending that is our beginning, the question of whether to follow, whether to become new, whether to live into our truth, into a life that has always been within us, that question becomes ours, every bit as much as it ever belonged to the original disciples. In this ending that allows us to continue the writing of the story of the gospel, not as a long ago narrative, but as our living reality, we become the disciples. Fearful, sometimes traumatized, still sitting in the shadow of so many crucifixions all around us, still sometimes struggling to believe in the things that don't fit into what we think we know about ourselves or the world, longing for visibility in a world that would erase anything that challenges the status quo. We become the disciples, staring into the face of the unknown, hearing the promises of resurrection, taking the power of our own stories, as yet unwritten. And we remember that the gospel, the good news, the promise of grace and life and resurrection is still moving in this world, because it is our story now. It is our reality now. We who live simultaneously in the shadow of the cross and in the knowledge of the resurrection, the new life fully enfleshed, out of the tomb, out of the valley of the shadow of death, out of the closet, calling us to come and see. We hear the good news, even as the first disciples did, in the midst of uncertainty and trauma. But the good news is still good, and it still calls to each and every one of us. Jesus goes before us, prepares the way for us, even, maybe especially, when we most fear, even, and perhaps especially, when we cannot imagine what comes next. We know that we will not be alone, and that the ending is ours to write, for all the world to see. Thanks be to God. Alleluia. Amen.